here. My name is Vanessa Okojie, and I'm from the Department of Political Science. My sponsor is Dr. Mark Puvong. And the presentation today is about, we're focusing on presidential gains of power. And I look at two specific theories, which are the theory of persuasion and personality, which are two really big theories within looking at the president. And so, yeah, just getting right into it. So a little bit about the paper. Presidents have had monumental increases in power, and Congress has had monumental decreases in power. And when I started writing the paper, one thing that I really asked myself was, is Congress giving that power to the president, or is the president taking that power for themselves? And so that's something that I keep in mind throughout this presentation. So the institutional nature of the presidency has forced the president to use tactics outside of those built into the Constitution or implied from the Constitution. So what we see is that presidents are now starting to use informal mechanisms to gain more power. And when we talk about power, it's important to focus on outcomes, so what actually is produced, and specifically to focus on political power, which is having another actor or another branch of government do something that they otherwise would not have done, to get some sort of outcome that the president or whoever is seeking the power wants in their favor. So like I said, the paper focuses on two specific theories, persuasion and personality, which boil down into looking at the president from an institutional model versus a personal model. And I specifically focus on the case of President George W. Bush and his mobilization for the war in Iraq. This was one of the most amazing kind of showcases of presidents gaining power from Congress. And so I chose to focus on this so we can actually assess how President Bush was able to take the country into war. And so the goal of this paper is really to examine how presidents successfully or unsuccessfully wield power over Congress. So just a little bit of background about the case of Bush. So President Bush took us into the war in Iraq 2 years after the 9/11 attacks. So the American people were very vulnerable. We all wanted questions about what happened. And so this created the perfect circumstance for President Bush to kind of frame the war in favor of going to war. And so what we see is that from intelligence, Iraq was not connected to the 9/11 attacks, but Bush still was able to take that his position and kind of frame it so that the American people would be in favor of going to war in Iraq. And one of the main proponents of his argument, developing weapons of mass destruction, and that Iraq was connected to terrorists in some way. So the outcome that we focus on is the authorization for the use of military force against Iraq. This is something that Congress passed to give the president power to go and use force in Iraq. And again, we go into Iraq in 2003. So the first argument that I look at is the argument of persuasion, written by Richard Neustadt. And what this argument says is that presidential power is the ability to persuade. So presidents have to bargain with other branches of government and not simply command them. So what we see is that presidents don't get to just call the shots, but they have to talk to the Supreme Court, to Congress, and even within the executive branch, talking with the bureaucracy. And so when the president has to utilize some sort of skill to navigate these different branches, we call that political skill. And so Neustadt says that there are three related sources of how presidents gain power. So one are the advantages inherent in the job of a president. So the president is able to tell the other actor, in this instance Congress, what he wants them to do is their responsibility. And so in this case, with going to war, the president is able to use national security directives, which are a way for the president to hold information secret from Congress. And so by holding that information secret, Congress does not know all the facts of the world. And the president is able to say that he knows certain facts that makes Congress's job to give him what he wants. And the second instance is that expectations regarding his ability and his will to use it. So there are expectations regarding the president's ability to use force or to be diplomatic, whatever. And then there's the probability of him actually using that ability. And third is the public's view of the president and the public's view of Congress if they do what the president wants. In this instance, high, they wanted questions after 9/11. And so Congress would then feel that they would have a high view if they do what the president wants. So does this apply to Bush? Yes. Persuasion was essential to the war drive in Iraq because the threat from Iraq was not direct. There was no military strike. There was nothing that actually happened that Iraq, the United States. So in this case, the United States was acting as the aggressor. So the two main reasons for going to war were Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction and alleged connection to terrorists. Intelligence found that they were not connected to the 9/11 attacks. Bush did not find evidence of the weapons of mass destruction development, and there was some sort of connection to terrorists, but it wasn't really something that Bush. And so in this instance, Bush made it virtually impossible for any member of Congress to oppose him and oppose what he wanted without in turn opposing democracy. And we even see there were alternative bills proposed. Then Senator Joseph Biden wrote an alternative bill that said that Bush could go to Iraq with a threat of force and then find what he was looking for and then come back to Congress to get force. But that bill obviously did not pass, and people were really in favor of allowing the president to get the force to go into Iraq. So under the pressure of 9/11, fear-mongering, and Bush's tactical misrepresentation, Congress handed him a blank check, and this is the outcome, which is the authorization for the use of military force. They handed this to the president preemptively. There was no actual facts that Congress knew, but they handed it to him. All right, so just going a little bit more into the argument and the three pillars. So one, advantages inherent in the office of the president. Because the institutional nature of the presidency, Bush was able to utilize those secret national security directives, and he claimed to know more about the state of the world than Congress did. And because of this, Bush was able to effectively convince Congress that they had the same interest, and this incentivized support and deference to the president in giving him more power. The second is that those expectations of the men regarding the president and his ability. So some legislators believe that Bush had diplomatic ability, and they believe that he would use diplomacy before force, so they were comfortable giving him this authorization. And some believe that they wanted Bush to be aggressive, and so they were even more comfortable giving him this authorization. But either way, both parties believed in Bush's ability to perform in a certain way and gave him the power to do it. And third are those men's themselves and the president. So there was high support for the war in the wake of 9/11. Congress is vulnerable to re-election, so they're always just trying to go with public support. And because of this, Congress cedes power to the president, and they're under the impression that this is what the people want. So what does persuasion power tell us? The president's office allows him leverage over other branches because he stands from a vantage point. As I said, the president has access to the state of the world that other members of the government do not. The presidents themselves determine the flow of power from those institutional sources of power. So if a president does say a certain thing or acts in a certain way, they're able to get more power from Congress or less power from Congress. Direct result of what they choose to do and how they choose to do it, that gives them more or less power. And these choices are also the way that presidents can dissipate their power. So what are the shortcomings of persuasion power? Persuasion power does not account for unilateral action. A lot of the times, presidents do not have to go through Congress, and they find other mechanisms that we see. And this persuasion power assumes the parties to act on their behalf, which again, we are not seeing through the use of unilateral action. But it is important to note that unilateral action, the scope of it is much more limited. And so we see presidents utilizing things like persuasion. Okay, so the second argument that I look at is David Barber's argument of personality. And so in this argument, he says that presidents are predisposed to act in one way or another because their individual character tendencies, and character forms the basis of presidential personality. So Barber creates this typology for assessing a president's power and assessing their character. So he starts with activity, which is what a president does, active or passive, and then effect, which is how a president feels about what they do, so positive or negative. And so this typology is used as evidence to the gain and use of power for presidents, according to Barber. And so does this apply to Bush? Barber characterized Bush as active president, and according to active positive, I'm sorry. And according to Barber, active positive presidents want most to achieve results, and they find their office in harmony with their personality. And when we look at this through the lens of Bush was confident and flexible. He created opportunities. He enjoyed power, and he used that power as a means to get results. And his dedication to the war effort shows us that he felt good about what he was doing, and he was able to do it positively. But there are many shortcomings of personality. So personality does not tell us enough about the process of how presidents gain power, and it leaves us to assume way too much. So one, we have to assume that presidents act alone and assume that there's no one in the ear of the president influencing them. Then we have to prove that the decisions that a president makes stemmed from their factors such as their worldview or public support. Because once we start talking about worldview, we start talking about institutions and behavior and how they're constraining behavior. So it's no longer talking about character. And then we must show that another president characterized differently would not have acted in the same way with the same circumstances before them. And we must show that another president characterized in the same way would not have acted differently with the same circumstances before them. And because those things are nearly impossible to prove, this is not generalizable, and we can't really say that this is how a president gains power because there's no formula to it. So I argue that we have to look at the presidency from an institutional perspective. When presidents enter their office, they enter an existing institution, and they're sworn in, and they have to find their place within that institution. So in order to find their place, they must utilize political skill, which is, again, having other actors do something they otherwise would not have done. And institutions have really made the office of the presidency what it is. And institutions constrain behavior, which is really important, and why I really argue that we have to look at the presidency from an institutional model, because institutions stop personality or character in its tracks. Because a president can be characterized as being very active, positive, and still not be successful because of those institutional constraints. And because of this, we must analyze the president from an institutional model to gauge power and to gauge effect. And by assessing what presidents actually do, by looking at what outcomes actually happen, we get So two theories, one set of facts. So the first theory is personal. Fundamentally, Barber versus Neustadt, we're talking about personal outlook of looking at the president versus an institution. And so Barber analyzes the personal president, and Neustadt analyzes the institutional president. Talking specifically about the personal president, of multiple personalities and still be successful or unsuccessful. We even see sometimes presidents with 2 terms are characterized differently in each term. So we can see that there are multiple personalities. And very little is from a barbarian analysis on its own, because we can't actually look at a president's character and say that is exactly how they got power. We have to look at their political skill. And once we start looking at how they navigate within the institution and how they influence other people, we're pointing back to an institutional model, and we're looking at behavior, not character. And so a barbarian analysis does not stand on its own, because it does not show us the mechanisms, and it does not show us any substantive achievement of a president. It doesn't allow us to use it on presidents. Like I said before, it's not generalizable. And a personal president also makes this sweeping generalization that the president is the most powerful person in government, which is completely false, and it's a very dangerous assumption to assume that the president is the most powerful. So personality tells us to believe that a president is powerful just because they've said so, but it gives us no empirical data to look at how a president utilized power, gained power, and got outcomes. So again, now we're looking at 2 theories, 1 set of facts. This is the institutional model. So Newsom's argument is inherently institutional, and we're ultimately analyzing the political skill of a president. And we're saying that if a president is able to utilize some sort of political skill, and that effect is viewed positively, they are successful. They will have the outcomes in their favor. And this gives us a roadmap to navigate how a president negotiates with Congress, Supreme Court or whatever actor, and we can examine how effective they were in a generalizable way. President's skill is also political skill, is weighed toward what a president actually does. It's empirical, and it shows us how a policy is materialized, which then gives us a broader explanatory value, because we can say then, if a president does X, Y, or Z, then Congress can do X, Y, or Z. It gives us something to look at more than one specific president. So in conclusion, persuasion was Bush's driving force in the war in Iraq, which we can see because of how Bush framed the war, and because of the political climate, Bush was able to get people on board. Persuasion is also a better predictor of power because it acknowledges institutional constraints. As I said throughout this presentation, there are constraints on behavior. A president is not all powerful just because they have a powerful personality. Be able to successfully navigate the constraints put on them through checks and balances and personality asks us to assume too much, and there's no way that it can be generalizable, because when we look at a president's personality, we cannot automatically assume that they're going to be successful. Presidents' informal power is directly controlled by their choices and their ability to influence those around them. So again, a president has the ability to kind of tap into sources of power from these other institutions based on the choices that they make, how they frame things, what they say, when they say it. The institution then is the tool for assessment. So we look at how a president is acting within an institution to assess how powerful they were. And so we must analyze the president from an institutional model through review of political skill. And the moment you move from character into behavior, the moment you stop looking at a president's character and start looking at their behavior, you begin to look institutionally, meaning that a personal assessment of a president does not stand. Because once we start looking at behavior, we have to look at what is creating that behavior, what institutions are stopping here. It's no longer just their character. And that institution could literally be a political party, it could be the actual institution of the government, whatever the institution is. And so, again, just giving us another summary, political power is having another party, in this instance with Bush, Congress, do something that they and to gain some sort of outcome in the president's favor. And so when we look back at Bush, we can see that Bush was able to get Congress to give him more power. Because when we take a step back and look at it, Congress, we have to assume, were rational actors, and they would not have just given the president power to go to war without knowing the facts of the world. They would not have just given away their power to declare war to the president unless the president was able to effectively make. Because we see that Bush was able to make Congress give him more power in something they would not have done, and he got the outcome in his favor, we can now say that Bush has political power, and we have to look at it from the institutions. And that's all I have. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for that very insightful presentation. I'm going to step in right now because it appears that Dr. Taylor is having some issues with the computer. And let me start by giving some housekeeping here. We will have both presentations given, and after that there will be questions. If you will put your questions over in the chat box, that will be great, and our tech team will funnel them to me, and I will ask the questions at the end of the sessions for each of the students. So at this point, we're going to move on to our next student presenter, and this presenter is going to be Cordell, and he's going to talk to us on the Seminole Wars of the 19th century, a look into the causes of the longest conflicts of the United States history. Cordell, if you'll please pull up your presentation, you may start at any time.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Cordell Moats. I am a Native American and Indigenous Studies minor at Valdosta State, and this project was done with the help of Dr. Laverne for one of our classes that we've been able to now present here. Right before I get started, I'd like to kind of throw a disclaimer at the beginning of this presentation, and kind of advise that this presentation will most likely go over some very graphic events and just maybe considered disturbing to some viewers. So I'd like to point that out and have that consideration in mind as I move forward. Also, I'd like to state that the use of certain terminology in this presentation is solely to assist with fitting the presentation into the context of previous historical work on these topics, and should not be interpreted to be used in any derogatory manner. And I would like to kind of apologize in advance in case it comes across that way. That is not the intended use of any sort of terminology. So a little introduction to the conflicts that I'm focused on. The Seminole Wars are a series of official military conflicts that were fought between the Seminole people and the United States from 1817 until 1858. The first war began in 1817, was fought until 1819. The second war began in 1835 and was fought until 1842. And the third Seminole War began in 1855 and was fought until 1858. This is a long period of time, and that means that these wars took place over a time when Florida, which is the area of land where most of the hostilities occurred, was under Spanish control, as well as when the area was a United States territory, and the wars would even continue past the point of the land of Florida becoming an official state. So while these three official wars are often studied together, they're also often treated as separate events. So when I began this project, I looked at the causes of each of these three wars, and in doing so, I found that these three events could be linked together into one continuous conflict with two ceasefires. And with this in mind, today I'd like to highlight these connections between the three wars to support this new single war theory. So the first major issue that contributed to conflicts between Seminole and white societies was how white society failed to recognize the complexities of Native American communities. Initially, Seminoles were grouped into the larger Creek Confederation, which by the start of the First Seminole War had already been forced into a treaty with the United States. This treaty surrendered the Creek Confederation's land claims, and because of the confusions on how white society saw the Seminoles, it often led to conflicts between the Seminole people and white settlers. So another complexity of Seminole society was their understanding of justice. Seminole justice differed in many aspects from settler justice, most notably regarding the issue of like retribution. Seminole justice did not include constructs of imprisonment, which was a major portion of settler justice. Settlers also failed to understand the importance of repayment in Seminole society. And so these differences would lead to separate interpretations of many war-causing events, such as the Garrett killings, the instances of cattle rustling, and the Scott Massacre. An issue that played a majorly important part in causing the wars between the Seminoles and the United States would be the issue of slavery. Settlers often feared the connections between Seminoles and enslaved people, and this was especially concerning for white society in regards to the acceptance of slaves into Seminole society, as it was considered a threat to white authority. Slavery also existed among Seminole society. However, it was one of a very benign status, meaning that it allowed for much more freedom than the slavery of white society. This status also led to better living conditions among the Seminoles for slaves that were being held in the southern United States. And because of these better living conditions, it would contribute to fears in the United States that that enslaved people would attempt to escape south to be accepted into Seminole society and escape the harsh conditions of slavery in the United States. When this would happen, the pressure from white society for the return of escaped slaves would only increase the bonds between slaves and Seminole people. And these bonds have been cited by some historians as the most important cause of all of the Seminole Wars. Escaped slaves also played a major role in events that contributed to war between the United States and the Seminole people, such as the presence of a community of escaped slaves in an abandoned fort along the Florida border prior to the First Seminole War. The existence of this fort exacerbated tensions along the border of Florida and Georgia, and especially after the United States military destroyed the fort and forced the surviving escaped slaves away from where they had settled. Prior to the official start of the Second Seminole War, the involvement of slaves in the Dade Massacre, which was a Seminole attack on a military battalion, contributed to the belief that slaves were leading hostilities between the Seminoles and the United States. This contemporary belief has been proven to be false. However, it did affect how the Second Seminole War began and was carried out. So the term immigration is complicated when used in Native American studies. In everyday use, we usually think of immigration as moving somewhere better. But for Native people, such as the Seminoles, it was almost always a movement to somewhere worse. And in many Native cultures was equated with annihilation. So prior to the Seminole Wars, settlers feared being in close proximity to these Seminole peoples and encouraged the government of the United States to forcibly remove them from the area. Also, throughout the 19th century, during the entire period of the conflicts, settlers would always try to limit Seminole opportunities in a hope that they would just quietly leave. They would do this by limiting movement, limiting trade options, and it was in an attempt to just encourage Seminoles to go elsewhere. But the Native people did not want to leave their land and would resist this through the continuing conflict. So the last major issue that permeated the entire period of hostilities between the Seminoles and the United States that I'd like to discuss today was the living conditions among the Seminole people. To state that these conditions were bad or harsh would underscore just how horrible these conditions actually were for the Native people. Many of them were forced to the point of starvation and poverty that would severely harm their society and force them to have to address the issue of interacting with the United States. One contributing factor that led to these harsh living conditions was the fact that they were meant to receive some appropriated money, but this money was being basically just stolen and funneled into the pockets of government agents instead of going to help the people that it was set aside for. This would continue all the way through the Seminole War era, through the Third Seminole War, which by that time the Army had adapted a attrition strategy that was meant to persuade the Seminoles to accept immigration to the West, which is now to lands that are in present-day Oklahoma. And it was just an attempt to undermine their place in their own lands. So here are some of my sources. Unfortunately for this project, I had to rely heavily on secondary sources, as primary sources regarding this period of time are very limited. It's somewhere that I'd like to continue some research into the future, in my future work on this topic. I'd also like to include some more sources that have been written from an Indigenous perspective moving forward. And so this is merely a start to a much longer project that I hope to continue with. So thank you for attending today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you both. I think we have our moderator back. So Chuck, if you want to take over and start the questions.
Can everybody hear? All right, we had some comments for our first talk, Okojie's talk, and one comment was the pattern that Bush used similar to fear and propaganda that were used in previous wars? And a second comment was, did Bush have more control military-wise compared to other presidents?
All right, can everyone hear me? I have a red bar, not quite sure.
Did you hear that?
Yes, you're
Okay.
fine. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. So to the first question about propaganda, I would say that this is similar in a sense, because when you have war, you have this, fear and propaganda that gets people on your side. When you're able to get to that, kind of instinct of people, you obviously get things in your favor. But I do think that this is a little different because Bush was acting preemptively and Congress gave him power to do that without actually knowing facts of the world. So fear and propaganda helped him to frame it better, but it also came down to, can he convince these people that the world is at stake or that democracy is at stake? Which then is also tied into fear and propaganda. And I don't quite remember the second question.
Did Bush have gained more control military-wise compared to other presidents?
I think that Bush did have not necessarily more control, but he had different circumstances. As tactics such as persuasion, and when we look at the military or when we look at wars, a lot of the times presidents are acting after something has happened to the United States or acting with something that is common going on. But Bush was able to take us into a country that really did not have aggression, did not have any influence with 9/11, things like that. So I think that it's not necessarily more control, but he did have more skill in allowing Congress to just give him that power.
Okay. Are there other questions? I remember there was pushback on letting UN inspectors continue their search for weapons of mass destruction, but the fear seemed to overwhelm any notion of continuing to use them. So that's part of the power and fear persuasion there.
Oh yeah.
We do have a question for Cordell from Sage Hage, which the question is, how much of an impact did the slaves have on the Seminole War?
For the events of the war itself, the fighting that would occur between the United States military and the Seminole people, I would be inclined to kind of say that my research indicated that they did not have a large involvement there, but that as far as the United States and the United States military was concerned, that they were believed to have a high involvement. Like, it was believed that enslaved individuals were kind of controlling the Seminole people. And what I've also found in my research was that this belief kind of further, it was used to further like imply that Native people were inferior because it was believed that they couldn't resist the United States the way that the Seminole people were doing, and so they must have been being controlled by the enslaved individuals that were living among them. So in reality, they did not have a large impact other than within the contemporary belief of the United States at the time.
Who was president during the first?
Wonderful, thank you. Vanessa, we have a question for you from Dr. Knowles. He wants to know if any new research questions have been uncovered by you during your research.
Thank you. So I think, well, one, this research really helped me to kind of have more admiration for how things kind of happen in government and seeing what actually goes into outcomes being done. It also made me kind of want that this imbalance of power a little bit more and review other tools within the arsenal of the president, and even maybe look at Congress and how Congress has given or how Congress has maybe even taken power back, and just kind of look at that a little bit deeper than what I did within this presentation.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Cordell, we have a question from Karen Moats. Did the Seminoles welcome the slaves into their tribes, or did they consider them to be invaders?
If I remember correctly, they were very open and welcoming to any escaped individuals that had escaped slavery from the United States. They didn't really look at them as invaders. They were very open to having people enter their tribe as long as they weren't trying to force their own culture onto the Seminole people. But yeah, they didn't really see them as invaders. They saw them as another group that was facing the same sort of discrimination and hostilities from white society that they were going through. So it was a very strong friendship and bond between the two, not really any sort of animosity between them.
Wonderful, thank you. Vanessa, I have a question for you. I was wondering, and then I realized this is outside of the scope of your research, but I wondered if you could talk about the popularity of President Trump in terms of what you found out from President Bush.
Yeah, sure. So I think that, it's easy to look at someone like Donald Trump and say that he was, powerful. He had a lot of personality that got people on his base. But when I, look down at what Trump was able to accomplish or not accomplish, it drives us back to looking at it from an institution. And I find that President Trump utilized political skill to get some things done, to get Congress to, move over in some ways. And then we also see where he did not have political skill and Congress was able to stop him from gaining more or from having an outcome that he achieved. So while their personalities and their popularity is important to get Congress to do what they want, if the president is not able to affect areas, that popularity only goes so far when it comes to actual outcomes.
Well, and as a follow-up question, what do you think will be the impact of our current president?
Honestly, I guess we'll have to see, because I know Biden has had a lot of things that he's promised to get done, and it really depends on the institutions that are around him. So Congress right now is, made up of both Democrats in the Senate and the House. So like right now, there may be room for him to utilize skill, but in either of those chambers change, I think that we'll see more pushback on Biden's ability to use political skill. And I guess we'll just have to see. But I know that it really does boil down to if you're able to get other actors on board with what you want.
Excellent. And thank you for answering those, because those were outside the scope of your research, but you did very well on those answers. Cordell, I have a question for you from Chastity Hamilton. Do you feel as if the Seminole perspective would be more accurate, as Native Americans are historically known for the passing down of history?
I know just in the field of history, we've often kind of dismissed oral traditions and like oral histories from the use of in history, and I think that's where we kind of lose out a lot of knowledge from Indigenous people. As to the accuracy, I think it would at least show how the Native people, in this case the Seminoles, kind of viewed the conflicts. I think the accuracy would be about the same, because just the kind of human nature is to distort things to make yourself look the best as possible. But it's important to get a full picture of your study, and not just study the side of the winners or the losers, but to include both perspectives, and to make sure that you're not presenting any biases. So it may be the same level of accuracy, but it's still extremely important to include those sorts of things. As far as like how they pass down their history and whatnot, I know it's mostly through oral traditions. There's not a lot of writings and whatnot. So if that's something that I ever get the chance to do, to like get the chance to include some oral histories into my research, that'd be a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you. Vanessa, Dr. Swan has a question for you. How do executive actions outside institutions, such as executive orders, impact this analysis?
Okay, thank you for that. As I kind of alluded to within my presentation, executive orders are limited in their scope. While they do get around the other branches of government, they're limited in what the president can actually write on in terms of putting things into law. But even then, they don't hold as much weight when we look at the long term regarding outcomes and impact, because a president can come in the next 4 years and change whatever executive order was put in. But when we look at things like Congress actually giving power to the president, we see that Congress is like giving power away. So for example, in the case of military wars or things like that, Congress has been trying now to get that power back from the president, because it continues to be added on rather than subtracted every election cycle. And so Congress has passed multiple legislations trying to get the war-making power and the use of force back from presidents, and has been slightly successful, but mostly unsuccessful in getting all that power back. But things can easily be changed by president, but they do give him short-term power. So I think the main difference is the long-term effect of the outcome.
Wonderful answer. I have a question for Cordell. This is from Dr. Taller. He says that, this is my question for Cordell, is who was president in the first war? Was it Jackson? If so, this is a case of fear and propaganda that Vanessa talked about. Is this a case?
So actually, the first Seminole War where Jackson became famous after the War of 1812, Jackson kind of started making his name for himself. The first Seminole War, he was still a commanding general. He was the general that led most of the events of the first Seminole War. I cannot remember the actual president at the time. I think it may have been Monroe, but I wouldn't want to be quoted on that because I'm not exactly sure. The dates kind of get mixed up in my head. But yeah, Jackson was a large military force at the time, and so like his personal opinions actually were extremely important to how the war was fought, and how it was carried out and whatnot, because he was the actual commanding general in the field. He was in Florida at the time. He by the end of the first Seminole War in 1819, Jackson actually kind of overthrew the Spanish colonial government in, I believe it was Pensacola, and basically just kind of took over a section of the Florida territory from Spain. And actually, he got into a lot of trouble with the president at the time. I'm not sure which one it was, who had expressly told him not to do that, to not take any actions against the Spanish government in the territory, but only to fight the Seminole people. And he ended up doing the exact opposite of what he was told. So as far as Jackson, and with the first Seminole War, he was extremely important to how it was fought and played out and everything. But he was not president at the time. He was the general.
Thank you. We actually have two more questions, and we have time for two more questions, one for each of you. So Vanessa, we're going to start with a question by Dr. Pufong. How does persuasion differ from truth? Did Bush have to be honest? What did Trump have to be for more persuasive? What did Trump have to do to be more persuasive?
Okay, thank you. So persuasion and truth are kind of wrapped in each other. Being more persuasive, you might have a little bit more of half truths rather than whole truths. When we look at Bush versus Trump, I think that Bush utilized persuasion, but he also did utilize honesty, because everybody kind of wanted answers, and I think that also played into how he framed the war, or getting. I think that he utilized a lot of persuasion in that because, according to intelligence, Iraq was not the enemy that we should have been fighting at the time, at least in terms of 9/11. Trump also has to be honest about certain things, but we can see that Trump is also very persuasive about certain things and kind of just has to get people to believe him. And so I think that it depends on the circumstance, because going into a war, you need to have some truth in it. Going into anything, you need to have some truth in it, but depending on the circumstance, I think that it would be better to use more persuasion and more rhetorical skill and political skill rather than truth. And in other circumstances, it may be better to use truth over persuasion as much.
Okay, thank you. Our last question is to Cordell from Dr. Swan. Cordell, they say that the victors write the history. So what do you think the U.S. gained by downplaying the idea of an ongoing war?
So first off, I pulled up my paper. It was President Monroe that was president during the first Seminole War. And then the gaining what the United States gained by downplaying the idea of an ongoing war would be that during what has traditionally been referred to as the interwar periods, the times of ceasefire between the two combatants, the Seminoles and the United States was able to focus on other issues, other concerns, and pay less attention to the ongoing conflict. So even though there was still conflicts among the Seminoles and the United States during those interwar periods, those times of ceasefire, um, the United States didn't have to pay attention to it because they weren't actively at war anymore. So I think that's like the biggest benefit for the United States at the time, to downplay the fact that they were still in conflict with the Seminole people, was just by not officially being at war with them anymore, the United States was able to not focus on the Seminole issue.
Thank you. Well, we've come to the end of our webinars, and I have to say it's been a fabulous day. I've learned a lot, and the students have just been fantastic all day. I want to thank everybody for all their work, and Danielle and Jess for all their work on the symposium today on the webinars. And I hope to see you all tomorrow.